Hello, everyone, and welcome to Concordia University's For Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event. These will be the final reflections on teaching disinformation in the classroom. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from For Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at For Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities to examine research questions and projects in development here at the university. We're running this event as a live stream meeting, so you're welcome to place your comments and questions either using the raised hand function or via the chat if you're joining by Zoom. And for those of you in the space, if you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising a hand and we'll be sure to get a microphone to you. So with that, it is now my pleasure to hand it over to Professor of Classics, Modern Languages and Linguistics, Bradley Nelson.
Thank you very much. And thanks, everybody, for sticking it out to the bitter end. The title of this session is, yes, Final Reflections on Teaching Disinformation in the Classroom, which when you read it like that, makes it look like we're actually teaching disinformation in the classroom, which may, in fact, be the case sometimes. I would like to, again, thank some people for running what for me has been a wonderful conference, a wonderful opportunity to see in person some people I've been wanting to meet and work with, and to actually plant some seeds for future collaborations down the line. And so I'd like to thank the Fourth Space staff, again, Jacqueline, Douglas, and Bertie for running such a tight ship here. I'd like to thank the group of that has been managing the event out of our own team. So Manas and Franklin and Daniela, you guys have done an amazing job. It's been very smooth. I'd like to thank all the organizers again for putting together such great panels, and for everyone, for buying in and investing in this experiment and bringing so many different perspectives together around the topic of misinformation. And I think one thing that I've learned is that there are actually more perspectives that we can bring in the future, and we'll certainly be looking to do that. I do also want to mention that coming out of this, I'm hoping to put together a collected volume of pieces. I'm still thinking about what that call for papers might look like, but to give you sort of a preview, Vivek Venkatesh here and our colleague Nelson Varas Diaz are the head editors for a new series at Lexington Press on extremity. And I will say much more about what extremity means when I send out the call for papers, but I think I'm looking forward to some conversations about what that volume would look like, and the call will probably come out in the summer, and the papers would be, I would be wanting those essays or contributions, and I encourage you to do collaborative contributions if you like. I think it would be in the spirit of the conference, probably a year from this September, something like that, just to give you a preview of the timeline. And with that, we're going to get into our presentations today on final reflections. All of us have been thinking about, David and Kevin and I have been thinking about these remarks since the beginning of the conference. I don't think we have any transformative or, amazingly illustrative or illuminating things to say, but I think that this does give us a chance to bring some of the things together, and it's going to give me a chance to get back to literature in my comments, which I've been looking forward to doing since yesterday. So we'll start with David Waddington, who's currently completing a book on video gaming, but I don't think that's what he's going to tackle today, but I did want to mention that so that you can put that on your future book buying and reading material. David, take it away.
Well, thanks a lot there, Brad. I mean, honestly, academic books, you really need all the help you can get. I mean, so if it sells 20 copies, that's probably a big seller, especially if it's like 20 copies to individuals instead of libraries. That's, you know, really, you're killing it in that case. So, yeah, I mean, I'm delighted to be, well, let's see, okay. Having a few troubles with these slides. Why am I? Oh, look, they seem to be working. Yeah, okay, that's fine. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today, it's called, you know, disinformation, questioning the appeal to education. And this really is a response, I think, to some of the presentations that we've had earlier, but it's also a reflection of my own kind of struggle with this problem myself as a person working in education. All right. So a few years ago, I was invited to participate in a panel at AERA that later became a special issue of a journal called Educational Psychologist. And the panel was about, well, what do we do about science disinformation? And so most of the people on the panel, including the guy that I ended up co-writing an article with, were science educators. And big surprise, the response of the science educators to what should we do about science disinformation is science education. Okay, I mean, I know you didn't see that coming, but there you go, all right? Basically, the thought is, we just gotta hit people harder with science. You know, we haven't been hitting them hard enough, and we've gotta hit them harder. They're not believing in science enough, okay? And so, I mean, this is a representative quote from one of the papers in the special issues. And again, I mean, of course, I'm not really doing justice to the sophisticated and careful thinking of my fellow scholars here by caricaturing their views, but you know, what the heck, I'm going to do it anyway. So here's a quote from one of the papers, quote, "Although the results of ignoring science vary from case to case, when people disregard scientific evidence, they are usually ignoring the most rational attempts to answer societal and personal questions. To counter this, people must believe in the epistemic authority of science." And this is from a paper, it's called like Sealing the Gateways to Post-Truth or something like this. It's got a very dramatic title, okay? So whenever I was hanging out with these science educators, I mean, I kind of have these moments where I'd feel like alienated and disoriented, and I'd be like, you know, seems to me like these guys are just recapitulating some 19th century discourses here. You know, I mean, it's a terrible thing to say about your fellow colleagues, but you know, I had the thought nonetheless, okay? And so there's this guy, Jean-François Lyotard, who wrote a book called The Postmodern Condition, all right? So you can check that one out. It was actually written originally as a report for the government of Quebec. But one of the interesting things that you see actually in Lyotard's book, okay, is there's this idea, if I can just move part of this window, whoa. All right, let's go back. Yeah, there's this idea, Lyotard thinks there are a couple of sort of big stories, you know, grand meta-narratives that kind of run through modernity, that kind of justify the modern project, okay? And one of these key meta-narratives is what he calls science as the hero of liberty, okay? And here's the key quote. "All peoples have a right to science. If the social subject is not already the subject of scientific knowledge, it is because it has been forbidden by priests and tyrants. The right to science must be reconquered." Okay? And if you look, okay, if you look at a lot of 19th and, well, even, I mean, 18th century ideas, I mean, you'll see that especially amongst early educational thinkers, there's this kind of incredible faith that if you just expose people to the right information, if you just, you know, kind of get the religious blinders off them and expose them to the majesty and the power of this new intellectual discourse, the scales will fall from their eyes and they'll suddenly become these kind of rational, contributory citizens. Okay, so there's this, I mean, it's really remarkable, like you see, like Joseph Jacotot, there's this wonderful book by Jacques Rancière called The Ignorant Schoolmaster that talks about this this really pioneering educational thinker in the Napoleonic era, Joseph Jacotot. And, you know, Jacotot has this idea that if you just put people in the presence of science, if you just have people read the books, you know, that's enough. Right? I mean, they'll be transformed. And you also see this idea. You see this idea a lot in late 19th and early 20th century progressive education. Okay, so for those of you who aren't in education, I mean, progressive education was a huge reform movement that swept, well, American education especially, but I mean Canadian education as well by extension. It started at the end of the 19th century and basically continued right up until the 50s and the 60s. Okay, and when we think about progressive education, we're actually kind of familiar with, I'd say, some of the more obvious aspects of it. So we think, you know, progressive education means being child-centered, or progressive education means emphasizing learning by doing, or emphasizing experiential learning. And I mean, progressive education was absolutely about all of those things, okay? But that's not the most interesting or central idea in progressive education. That wasn't really what animated the progressives more than anything, okay? What animated progressive educators more than anything was a kind of idea of criticality, okay, and an idea of developing an understanding of your own society. So I say here, the critical idea is you should develop a critical understanding of your own society, and that being well-informed and scientifically literate is critical. You know, sound familiar? Okay, does that sound familiar from the last couple of days? All right, because those ideas were very much at the heart of the progressive educational project, okay? And here's a lovely little quote from John Dewey. This is from School and Society, a book that was written in 1899. So we see here, learning has been put into circulation. Knowledge is no longer an immobile solid. It has been liquefied. It is actively moving in all the currents of society itself, right? So, you know, science, the hero of liberty, you know, part 50 million, here we are. All right. So, but, you know, did the progressives actually understand disinformation? You know, look, it seems, how can you be making this comparison, Dave, to these guys who were writing 100 years ago? They didn't really understand disinformation, did they? But, well, actually, yes, they did. Yes, they did. And the reason that they did, okay, well, I mean, even Dewey, writing in 1899, was very kind of concerned about the plight of the citizen in industrial society, and, you know, did people have the right information, and were they empowered, et cetera. So there was already kind of some discourse about this. But after World War I, okay, I mean, you can look at World War I as a kind of massive, successful disinformation operation, okay? Because, of course, millions and millions of people were being slaughtered uselessly, and the folks back home thought things were going just fine, and, you know, the fight for peace and justice was continuing, all right? So, not surprisingly, after World War I, a few people who were involved in the extremely successful propaganda effort around it got a little bit upset and concerned and felt a bit guilty. Go figure, okay? So Walter Lippmann wrote this amazing book called Public Opinion, where he analyzed propaganda strategies, okay? And one of Lippmann's key targets was the vision that the progressive educators had. He said, well, look, you can't expect that much out of citizens. You can't expect them to be informed about everything. You can't expect them to have to kind of be disposed to inform themselves. It's simply asking too much out of the citizen, and the citizen is just too easily fooled by these propaganda, disinformation strategies. What are we going to do about this? And of course, Lippmann has a lot of answers to this. But I mean, the progressives were very concerned about what Lippmann said and spent a lot of time trying to respond to Lippmann and trying to kind of articulate their democratic vision and their ideal of the well-informed, scientifically competent citizen in opposition to some of the points that Lippmann had made about disinformation, okay? All right, so there's a lot that I'm gonna skip over here. All right, here's a question. Like, how much ground did progressivism really gain in the United States? And the answer is a lot, okay? Progressive education transformed the American school system. I mean, there are certain ways in which it wasn't successful, which I'll talk about in a moment, but this way of thinking absolutely swept schools of education and teacher education. I mean, it was the dominant educational ideology of the early 20th century. Everybody in schools of education, at least, really got behind this. And a lot of people really got behind it in school systems. I mean, especially school administrators, okay? Or particularly at the very high levels. Now, okay. The question is, though, how much of a difference did progressive ideas really make in the classroom? I mean, progressive education took over in the academy. It took over in schools of education. It kind of took over among a lot of school administrators. But Larry Cuban in this book, How Teachers Taught, says, well, you know, didn't really change classroom practice that much. Changed it a bit, but for the most part, teachers still taught in the same old way that they always taught. They still just told people stuff, and then the students had to like tell the stuff back on the test, right? It was the same old scene that we've seen in classrooms for a long time. So really, I mean, look, you have a movement that effectively took over the entire American school system, and most of the Canadian school system too, was extremely institutionally successful. But it didn't really make that much of a difference in terms of classroom practice. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the story of progressive ed is that the best case scenario is that it's actually hard to make this kind of stuff happen in classrooms. The worst case scenario is, well, you can't do it at all right? So, I mean, it's a bit of a grim narrative. Like, how possible is it to kind of make these moments of criticality and reflection and freewheelingness happen in the classroom? I mean, the history of ed does not tell us an optimistic story about this. Okay, but let's do a little thought experiment. Let's suppose that, you know, it worked. Let's suppose that we achieved the high levels of science literacy through education that we were looking for, okay? Yeah, people are becoming scientifically literate. Does this get us out of the woods? Okay, and as I mentioned earlier at the conference, I think the answer is no, okay? This is an article, it's called, here's the title, very descriptive title. Individuals with greater science literacy and education have more polarized beliefs on controversial scientific topics. So on the left, you have a graph. Here's the responses to a question about climate science. What gas do most scientists believe cause temperatures in the atmosphere to rise? We see liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans are aligned. As climate science literacy increases, you see that their probability of a correct answer increases for both of them. Then we have another question. Why is the Earth getting warmer? Okay, is it because of burning fossil fuels, or is it because of natural patterns in the Earth's environment? And guess what? As climate science literacy increases, you see that the conservative Republican group is actually more likely to give answer B. Okay, so with more education, you get people digging deeper into their bad point of view, into their climate denialist point of view. Okay. So, I mean, there is another article by a guy called Dan Kahan here and his collaborators. He has a nice little quote here. For ordinary citizens, the reward for acquiring greater scientific knowledge and more reliable technical reasoning capacities is a greater facility to discover and use or explain away evidence relating to their group's position. All right? So, more education just gives you greater rhetorical facility to justify what you and your fellow travelers already believe. Okay, so I want to ask, is it possible here? I mean, there's this idea of what we call educationalization, okay? Educationalizing a problem. And this is where we take a problem that is actually a problem that's the real locus is somewhere else in the society, but we kind of put it on the schools. We say the schools need to solve this problem, education needs to solve this problem. Is it possible that we're doing this in the case of disinformation? I think maybe the answer may be partly yes. at least. And what I want to leave you with, okay, today is, I think, one of my favorite articles on this whole topic. It's by a woman named Elisa Sobo. It's called Theorizing Vaccine Rejection Through the Looking Glass. Okay, and this is actually a qualitative study of Waldorf school parents. All right, so as some of you may know, Waldorf schools kind of have a sort of alternative educational ideology. I won't get into like what the ideology is because it's, you know, interesting, but pretty esoteric. But the bottom line is that one of the things that Waldorf schools are known for is vaccine refusal. And this was even before COVID, that they were known for vaccine refusal. And so Sobo studied vaccine refusal in these Waldorf schools. You know, what leads parents in these schools to kind of be vaccine refusers? Do they kind of make a calculation? Do they make a conscious decision about it? Do they lack education? And Sobo's answer is it's all about group membership. It's not about education. It's not about kind of rational decision making. And here's the two quotes from her article I like the best. She says, quote, "To engage in or endorse vaccination is to proclaim one's social communion with the mainstream. Similarly, to refuse a vaccination is to proclaim one's affiliation with significant others from beyond the mainstream. Like getting a gang tattoo, slipping on a wedding ring, or binge watching a popular streamed TV show, vaccine refusal entails an act of identification, of opting in, of proclaiming I belong and I share your values." So Sobo found the longer that parents are members of the Waldorf school, the more likely they are to adopt these vaccine hesitant beliefs. And she says, "Viewing refusal in this way entails a paradigm shift of great significance, one in which rejection is neither the primary feature nor the first step in refusing. Key to the affiliative equation infusing this new viewpoint is that rejecting another value set comes after the fact. Selection into the group precedes rejection. So I become a Waldorf school parent, and then as part of my group membership, I start to adopt these beliefs. It's not this kind of rational choice or lack of education situation that we typically predict. This is what Sobo argues. All right. So where does this leave us? Okay, I mean, certainly I don't want to dismiss what others have contributed so far. I mean, I think that education definitely has some contributions to make to disinformation challenges. But I also think we should be clear-eyed about both the current limitations of what we can do in the classroom and our past failures in terms of having historically tried to enact some of our current ideals. What can we learn from our failures to do it? So yeah, I think we should, I think a lot has been offered so far by others here at this wonderful collaborative conference that we've been having. But I do think I'd like to inject a doubtful note, and I'll end on that with that lovely rosy thought and pass things on to Kevin.
Thank you, David, for that very informative, historically situated, and insightful talk. I'd like to pass it to Kevin McDonough now, professor from McGill University, who's been working with teaching difficult topics in the classroom for some time.
Thank you, Brad, and thanks to everyone. It's been a really interesting couple of days. I wanted to, the focus of my talk is going to be on just reflecting on the question of the teacher's role in addressing disinformation, especially in politically polarized democracies. This has been a theme, you know, in the talks for the past 48 hours. And I've sort of shaped my reflections, you know, as I've learned and listened to what people have been saying. I wanted to begin by, you know, sort of telling you how I've thought about the difference between yesterday and today. I I've assigned a slogan to yesterday that I think captures pretty well, maybe not perfectly, but pretty well sort of what the spirit of the conversations were. It's like democracy dies in darkness, right? And the idea is that, you know, disinformation is darkening, and education's role is to bring it into the light where it can flourish. And the way it does that is by, you know, as Dave was talking about, you know, sort of teaching critical thinking, you know, more advanced technologies to help us detect, you know, fake images, fake texts, basically to, you know, eliminate ignorance. And if we can eliminate ignorance, we've, if not solved the problem, gone a long way towards doing so. You know, I think I'm going to shed some doubt on that, you know, sort of myth-busting kind of approach or express some doubts about that. But the slogan for today that I've you know, chosen is a quote or a phrase that Julia and Elena used in their presentation this morning: critical evaluation as a way of being in the world. Which I like a lot, and which, you know, at first might sound a lot like critical thinking, but I don't think that's what it is. It's not just that. It's you know, critical evaluation that takes into account you know, how people and why people, you know, focus on and select certain kinds of information as appealing, you know, their identities, their values, their preferences, the kind of communities they come from. And how those factors affect how they evaluate the information, and how it affects how they communicate and endorse certain conclusions. So, you know, the two slogans suggest two different answers for, you know, to the question of the teacher's role. One is more critical thinking, less ignorance. The other is, well, we have to kind of pay attention to, you know, the contextual factors and the social processes by which beliefs are formed, and people, you know, the way people come to endorse certain kinds of views. And all of this makes me think of a book that I haven't heard cited yet, but which you know, I think is a really good book and people would be interested in. It's by a philosopher, epistemologist, Neil Levy. It's called Bad Beliefs. And you know, one way of boiling down the goal of education might be to say that, you know, education should try to sort of discourage bad beliefs and encourage good beliefs, or at least, you know, help students to inoculate themselves from whatever, you know, processes, social processes might tempt them or lure them into forming bad beliefs. And Levy's book, you know, an important concept in the book is this idea of, you know, a polluted epistemic environment, including, you know, the very prominent role played by active, systematic, organized, manipulative agents. So through social media and other means that are really sort of trying to sort of drive people towards certain views, and to, you know, thereby polarize people into opposing views. But it might be worth just sort of reading out Levy's definition of a bad belief, because it captures, I think, the social nature of you know, the problem. It says a bad belief is a belief that A, conflicts with the beliefs held by the relevant epistemic authorities, you know, scientists or, you know, experts, and B, beliefs that are held despite the widespread public availability of either the evidence that supports more accurate beliefs or that relevant authorities believe as they do, or the relevant epistemic authorities are those people and institutions that are widely recognized as being in the best position to answer questions in the domain. So the idea is that not just the content of the beliefs that's the problem, but, you know, from an educational point of view, we need to sort of look at, you know, how people come to see certain sort of sources as authoritative. Oh, thanks, as authoritative, and others as suspect. I wanted to use this just to frame what I'm going to talk about, questions and thoughts I have about the teacher's role in this context. We've got these sort of two kind of competing views, right? The critical thinking or myth-busting view, and then the sort of, look, we need to pay attention to the social context of knowledge and the emotional identity aspects as well as on the other side. Ultimately what I want to get to is some reflections on, what it's actually like for teachers out there. I think, my affiliation or my inclination is towards the more social, approach to addressing the problem. I don't think addressing critical thinking is a bad thing by any means, or trying to, debunk ignorance, but I think that it's a limited approach, and in order to sort of really kind of lead people away from bad beliefs and towards good beliefs, you need to address the social and emotional sort of aspects, which I think a lot of people will agree with. But I think that approach is particularly vulnerable to certain sorts of problems that aren't widely recognized in polarized contexts, and that kind of lead me, I don't think I'm quite as pessimistic as Dave, but I think that it's really unfortunate that people respond so reflexively, to the question of what should we do about this by looking to schools and teachers. I think that there are a lot of reasons why it's, even with the sort of the good work that's being done by Julia and Elena on, good approaches to addressing these things, that there are lots of things that are making it really difficult for teachers to use those approaches, or even to become familiar with them and learn them. So that's kind of where I want to get to. But I want to start with a kind of idealized picture that I think will help to frame the issue. So the idealized sort of picture is a tension that is often, it's historical and it's philosophical, and it's one that I think is widely sort of known, but maybe not articulated quite this schematically. So I'm going to just lay it out there. So on the one hand, there's this idea that as public servants, teachers have an obligation to adopt a kind of nonpartisan role. We sometimes talk about this in terms of neutrality. I'm not going to use that term because I think it leads to confusion a lot of the time. So I'm going to say nonpartisanship. And the nonpartisan role is especially important when addressing controversial issues, right? Which are important for educational purposes. Controversy is often how learning happens. So the obligation of nonpartisanship comes from at least three sources, I think. One is the fact that teachers are public servants. Then they have an obligation sort of attached to that role of representing a diverse public, people who disagree about controversial issues. A second is that teachers have an obligation to educate and not indoctrinate. So that means trying to sort of be even-handed in the presentation of opposing views, regardless of what your own beliefs might be. And a third is that teachers have an obligation not to abuse their power. Their students are there at pain of breaking the law, right, or their guardians. So children are vulnerable for that reason, and parents also have rights. So teachers have to be sensitive to this. So that's sort of those are the justifications that lie behind this nonpartisan role, and that I think make it a compelling sort of aspect of teachers' identity. On the other hand, there's also a widely held view, historically entrenched, that teachers must be partisans of democracy, right? Schools are guardians of democracy. Public education arose out of a concern to, ensure that, democracy could be passed on from generation to generation. So, and teachers' role, is to affirm in a partisan way core democratic values and commitments, and to try to, ensure as best they can that students come to hold such commitments too. Or at least, it would be unfortunate if the inquiry, the spirit of inquiry that guides the classroom led to students adopting undemocratic values. So with that idealized picture in mind, we can sort of, think of the teacher's role in a kind of image, like according to the following image, right? There's a bright line between two distinct aspects of the teacher's role. On one side of the line, teachers should teach non-directively, right, on partisan issues and allow students wide latitude to explore and think and draw their own conclusions about issues. So I might think of, examples like, thinking about vegetarianism, climate change, abortion. On these issues, widely held view is that teachers should allow students to explore different views, think about them, reflect on them, disagree about them, and draw their own conclusions. On the other side of the bright line, there is a sense that teachers should affirm and encourage students to affirm foundational democratic values and principles, and in doing so, it follows logically that they should teach directively. That doesn't mean like in a kind of authoritarian way. There can still be a spirit of inquiry, but the idea is that you sort of, at least steer students or try to guide them towards certain conclusions and away from others. It's not sufficient, on this view, to allow students to think critically or, to think critically and draw their own conclusions about whether it's a good thing to discriminate against students on the basis of race, gender, religion, or other affiliations. Amy Gutman, has a nice line in her classic book, Democratic Education, that students in a democratic society first need to understand that principles like racism are wrong before they start to think critically about why they're wrong. If you start with the critical thinking, there's a good chance they're going to end up rejecting what democracy requires them to affirm. So that's the bright line sort of image, right, with two sides to it. Now, here is where I'm going to suggest there's a really hard problem that arises for practicing teachers today, especially. The kinds of issues that teachers find themselves addressing in classrooms today, and I'm drawing here on my research, but also on my own experience as a teacher educator, is that the issues they're addressing defy the boundaries of the bright line between directive and non-directive teaching and the corresponding dimensions of their role. So, for example, when male students come to class lauding the violently sexist values espoused by internet heroes like Andrew Tate, this is a big one for a lot of my students who are also teachers, they feel called on the one hand to address issues that are clearly at the heart of democratic citizenship, equal political status for all, regardless of gender, right, to put it in abstract terms. At the same time, though, they know and they understand that the meaning and interpretation of these issues is now becoming increasingly unsettled in the communities that they're serving, and the students, where the students that they're teaching come from, and that they're increasingly treated as controversial by large segments of that population. So if teachers directively encourage their students, in a kind of challenging way, to think critically about the sexist views spread by Andrew Tate on social media, they may find themselves not viewed as upholding democratic principles, but as denigrating men and masculinity, right? And this sort of issue is also at the heart of, I think, anti-CRT legislation in the US and in Florida and other states, where even mentioning historical examples of racism and slavery is often framed as anti-patriotic, patriotic, and as denigrating white citizens. All right. So those examples are just kind of, meant to suggest that the bright line between controversiality and non-directive teaching on the one hand, and issues that are to be treated directively because they're uncontroversial and because they're central to democracy, is increasingly fraught and uncertain. And teachers find the ground beneath their feet shifting as they navigate the terrain. And that's because the meaning and expression of the democratic principles that their rules is sort of attached to, and that they're meant to affirm, are increasingly, the meaning and interpretation of those norms is increasingly subject to radical reinterpretation. As people like Mira Levinson, as a philosopher of education at Harvard, and Ellis Reed have argued, the line breaks down even further in circumstances of what they call rapid norms shifting. Right? That is when democratic norms are subject to fast shifts in interpretation by one ideological, geographic, or generational community while remaining fixed elsewhere. In extreme cases, the meaning and interpretation of democratic principles of freedom and equal citizenship, political equality, affirmed by some citizens and groups, can be shifted quite rapidly and disorientingly, and fueled by sophisticated mechanisms of disinformation to justify the oppression and even murder of other citizens on the basis of race, religion, or gender identity, for example. And if you think that the dimension of murder is exaggerated, I think there are examples like the Charleston riots that could sort of be invoked. But my main point is just that what happens when this rapid norm shifting is highlighted is just how empty of content the democratic principles that we assume are kind of the stronghold of society are once rapid norm shifting takes hold, right? Eudora Welty, in her story, Where the Voice is Coming From, understood this back in the 60s, when she sort of wrote the story from the point of view of a white Southern man who's, the whole story is him sort of planning the assassination of a black civil rights activist, and he's talking to himself internally, and the inner monologue is all about how it's a free country. I don't have to listen to and there's lots of racist language, but in that sort of it's not impossible. It's not contrary to logic to interpret democratic principles in ways that are sort of completely opposed to what we would hope are inclusive and just social conditions. So the big question for me on this basis is, if we're in this sort of situation where teachers are, even, when addressing what might seem to many people as like the most anodyne, kind of basic democratic values are no longer, safe to accept as uncontroversial in those social conditions, what can they do? And I think there are things that they can do, and I think the practical suggestions that have been suggested here are really good ones and helpful, and I think that more thinking along those lines is needed. But at the same time, if you ask teachers, what's it like if you actually sort of take these up, or are you learning these things? I think you'll find that a lot of teachers will saying, in our teacher education programs, we're not being sort of introduced to this stuff. And I think there are reasons for that that are sort of important to think about. I don't think there's a consensus in education schools, say, between liberals and critical pedagogy theorists, that even this kind of nonpartisan role of the teacher is a good thing. which makes it hard to achieve consensus on how to organize teacher education programs around something like that. But also, you know, if you look in schools, you know, like in order to enact, if you had great methods and you knew how to, you had the skill to use them and implement them, you need institutional support. If you get, you know, parents get upset, right? Or if the community reacts, and that's just not there, right? I mean, teachers can't count on principals and school officials to support them in cases where they're going to get in trouble from addressing these sorts of issues. I'm rushing here because I'm sure I'm way over time, am I? Anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up. So institutional support is weak. Public trust in teachers and schools as agents of democracy is very fragile, and the wider public culture is, you know, what Neil Levy would say is, you know, highly epistemically polluted and therefore hostile to inquiry about these things. And schools are not detached from the culture in the way that they might be, you know, in a sort of more ideal democracy, where, you know, schools could kind of be somewhat insulated from the wider social conditions. So those are my sort of thoughts. I hope we can find ways to do this, but I think there are some big challenges out there.
Thank you, Kevin. This is on, right? So yeah, those are some major challenges. In about 2 minutes, I'm going to be wishing I had written something down other than taking some notes here. But I do think, following David, that one of the big issues is not understanding the scope of the problem or the intensity of the problem from a scientific point of view, right? And if you look at cognitive neurologists or social psychologists, someone like Daniel Kahneman, who's written 2 books, one called Thinking Fast and Slow, and another one called Noise. And basically the point zero that scientists like this start from is that we're hardwired to believe disinformation. We're actually hardwired to believe the first thing that somebody tells us, right? And to undo that later on is an enormous and often unsuccessful effort, right? In Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman basically does a lot of case studies on how people generally tend to trust their intuition, and their intuition is a 50-50 sort of proposition because it takes less energy. Intuition is more efficient, at least in the short term, than critical reflection or self-reflection, right? And so Kahneman writes ad nauseum in many different fields, right? How people who are highly educated, right, they tend to trust their instincts or their first intuition, and more often than not, it leads them in the wrong direction where scientific knowledge or political knowledge or other kinds of knowledge are concerned. And then when you bring this to study satire, for example, literary satire, and I'm a literature professor, and satire is one of the, you know, what we have thought as literary critics and literature professors for forever is that satire is a great tool for bringing students closer to the truth, for making them critical readers, right? But without guidance, without framing, without sort of establishing an apparatus for understanding satire, again, satire can be a 50-50 proposition. If you look at the Colbert Report, for example, which David Castillo does in depth, he and William Eggington in their book, What Would Cervantes Do, right? They look at the Colbert Report in depth. in their reading, right, Colbert makes a devastating attack, right, on Bush-era republicanism, on Trump-era republicanism, that after seeing Colbert, there's no way that you can, believe the world through Trump's or George Bush, the second George Bush's eyes. But if you look at the studies of social psychologists, it's the opposite, right? Whether or not you understand Colbert's satire depends almost 100% on what your political leanings are going into that show, right? So if you're a conservative Republican, you believe Colbert when he's making fun of pinkos and Democrats and liberals and commies. You think that that's a straight bit, right? And you get the satire if you have a predisposition, right, for the politics that Colbert actually espouses, which he explains in many cases outside of his fictional character. He explains that his intent is completely satirical. And the reason that satire is so difficult to communicate is that you have to have a previous understanding of the text, right? Previous knowledge of the text that satire is parodying or satirizing in order to get the joke, right? And so it's twice as hard, right, rhetorically, to communicate the satire and the truth that you want to communicate with the satire than it is with a straight lie, right? And so these are things that make it very difficult, as David and Kevin have pointed out, and the literature is full of examples of this, right? So I'll just bring up a couple of illustrations. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Cixin Liu's The Three-Body Problem. It's a trilogy. There's a recent series on Netflix. The scene I'm going to describe isn't in that. It'll be in a subsequent season, probably. Because this is in the second book of the trilogy, right? So if you're not familiar, it's a sci-fi trilogy, and basically the premise is there's an alien civilization that lives on a planet that is completely chaotic. There are 3 suns that revolve around this planet, or that surround this planet, and because their motions cannot be predicted, life on this planet just collapses from time to time, and no one can predict it. And so civilization has to rebuild it. So there's the premise of there's been like 90 million years of evolution on this planet until they have a stable era long enough for their science to advance to the point where they can build a fleet and flee the planet. And the planet they're coming to is Earth, right? And they found out about Earth because an astronomer on Earth is so disillusioned with how life and politics on Earth are going that she responds to a message from the Trisolarians. That means 3 suns, right? The Trisolarians, even though one of their rebels sends a previous message saying, don't answer this, they're coming, they're going to destroy you, do not answer this message. She answers it because she's so pissed off at her fellow human beings. She's like, we don't deserve to be here, right? So the Trisolarians are on their way, and they're going to get there in 400 years. And eventually all of planet Earth learns this, and all of planet Earth learns of the overwhelming technological superiority of the Trisolarians. And so they lose, Earthlings start to lose heart, right? They become nihilists in the end, right? But, a lot of Earthlings are going to stick with it. They're going to give it that college try and, they figure they have 400 years, right? You got to at least give it a try for 400 years. In one of their brain experiments, they figure out how to trigger a certain mechanism in the brain to get a human to believe something that's the opposite of the truth, right? So in the example they use is that water is toxic, right? So they send the message, the water is toxic, to a certain part of the brain, and when the person wakes up, they will not drink water. And even if you explain to them, you are 70% water. You will die without water. The person will not drink the water. So they're going to use this mechanism to convince the armed forces that they can win, because, you know, it's the military that's the biggest problem, because they're the ones who are most depressed about this technological inferiority, right? And I don't know if the author is thinking about this, but it made me think about, you know, the amount of resources that Google and OpenAI have to spend on, you know, creating and improving ChatGPT and deep fake machinery and whatever, versus the sort of paucity of resources that we have in the university to create mechanisms to fight this. But the point I want to make about the novel is that these soldiers line up, you know, one after the other to have their brains altered so that they will believe that they can win this war, right? And so they believe in something that is the opposite of the truth. And they line up willingly to do this, right? And so there's a literary example of some of the things that David was talking about in terms of belief in human-caused climate change or not, right? They know it's false, but they're going to believe it anyway, because there are other reasons, right, for them to believe that. And of course, you're not going to escape without an example from Miguel de Cervantes. But this doesn't come from Don Quixote. It comes from a short play called The Marvelous Tableau. It's a very short play. It takes place in rural Spain in the 16th century, and it tells the story of a couple of con artists who show up in a town. And of course, the con artists, their main goal is to make some money before they leave town. And they're going to put on this marvelous show for the townspeople, right? The thing is, though, there are some conditions for the townspeople to see this show, okay? And here it starts to look a little bit like, or a lot like, The Emperor's New Clothes, right? Which is also a story that appeared for the first time in Spain, but that's in like the 13th century, right? So in order to see what's going to be in the marvelous tableau, you have to be the legitimate son of your parents. You have to be of old Christian birth, and they say the four ribs of your lineage, like both grandparents on both sides, right? And you have to be an honorable old Christian, right? These are the conditions in which you are to see the marvelous tableau. And so chanfaya, right, which is sort of a combination of two words. One is blackmail, chantaje, and the other one is falla, which is like error. Chanfaya erects a blank sheet, and when the show starts, he starts to narrate things that are on this blank sheet. It's obvious there's nothing on the sheet, right? But because of the conditions and because of the townspeople are so fearful of not being honorable old Christians, a couple of them start to say, yes, I see it. I see it. And then the images become more and more fearful, right? And most of them are images having to do with anti-Jewish propaganda, anti-Muslim propaganda, right? Some scenes from the Old Testament. And the townspeople get more and more frantic, right? The scarier these images get. There's one spectator, however, who we see from his internal dialogue, right? And he's like, I don't see anything. I don't see a goddamn thing on that screen, right? And he says, but because of the black honor, right, the goddamn honor, I'm going to have to say that I see something that I don't. Right? And so he becomes one of the most fervent spectators at that time, right? And they're all overreacting. And in the end, one of the spectators actually gets up to dance with Salome, who's being described on this screen, right? Salome, one of the great enemies of, St. John the Baptist. I don't know if you know the story of Salome, but she was the daughter of Herod, who had who had captured John the Baptist, and he asked his daughter to dance, and she said, "I'll only dance if you give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter," right? And so she dances, and here's an old Christian dancing with Salome, right, who's not there on the screen. At the end of this play, what happens is quite different, however, from what happens at the end of the Emperor's New Clothes, right? At the end of the Emperor's New Clothes, you'll recall the Emperor parades through town on a horse, naked, and a child points out that he's naked, and the whole edifice collapses, and the king is embarrassed and whatnot, right? In this case, a military official comes into town, right? Because the army is passing through, and the town is going to have to billet these soldiers, which is always a catastrophe for a town in Spain, by the way, right? Having to billet soldiers is a catastrophe in terms of economic resources. It's a catastrophe in terms of sexual violence when the soldiers, show up. But this captain shows up, and he says, "What the hell's going on here?" Right? They say, "Well, we're having a play," and he says, "There's no play, there's nothing there." And instead of the edifice collapsing, right, the townspeople say, "He's one of them. He's one of them, he's a Jew," right? Exilis est, right out of the Latin, the Latin version of the Bible, right? And so instead of the edifice collapsing, it becomes reinforced, right, by the ideological need, the political need of these townspeople to not let their precious myths collapse. Okay? This would be one of those examples of how Cervantes shows the box, right? How the box of belief functions. Okay? It's a very, in some ways it's very simple, in some ways it's very complex, but these are the kinds of things that I try to teach in the classroom to combat disinformation. It's related, but I did want to come back to the science to talk a little bit about a science fiction course that I just taught and some of the science theory that I used to set up our discussions of the science fiction. And of course, I'm coming at this as a literature professor, not coming at it as a scientist, but I'm not, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Donna Haraway's work. She's like a feminist scientist who deconstructs Western certitude, would totally destroy, with a couple of gestures, the positivism that, but you're right, it's a 19th century positivistic scientific view, what David was citing at the beginning of his presentation. But Donna Haraway deconstructs that point of view by unveiling the violence of Robert Boyle's modest witness. Robert Boyle's a 19th century English scientist who did a lot of experiments on animals in a vacuum, right? And Haraway reads this vacuum allegorically in the sense that what Boyle wants to do is remove all of the social context, all of the environmental context, and study these animals and their mechanisms and their systems, all by themselves, removed from all external influences and environment. And of course, what happens in the vacuum is that the animal simply dies, right? It expires, right? But the important part for Haraway is this myth of the modest witness, right? Who's supposed to be invisible, but he's inevitably male. He inevitably has a political context, right? And when a woman scientist who is allowed to go into the Royal Society tried to participate in these experiments, her observations were discarded because they were partial, because they were situated in her feminine context, right? The male gaze didn't have a context, okay? The feminine gaze had a context, and this is what made it imperfect, right, and unscientific. But for Haraway, this is the scientific point of view, right? The situated knowledge, the partial knowledge, the historicized knowledge, right? and this is a much more contemporary view of science as well in quantum, in quantum terms, right? The big shift from classical physics to quantum physics, one of the big shifts was the inclusion of the human point of view in the construction of knowledge, right? And I think that this, at least in my class, provided us a pathway for the students to embody their own perspective, right? Explore their own perspective and use it as a strength instead of trying to make themselves disappear and try to find the real meaning in the text or the real meaning in the world around them. And I think that all of the tools that we've been looking at in terms of deconstructing disinformation, handing them over to the individual, I think is a great start and what we have to do to deconstruct disinformation. But we also have to empower, right, these individuals, which is what I think we're doing with these tools, and sort of move away from the idea that there is a scientific fact, right, or that science is anything other than a process, right? I think that to end on a positive note, it's true that we are few, right, and that the challenges are great. But on the other hand, I also feel that we're at the beginning of this process of combating disinformation. And I think that there's much work that we can do together to improve our work on combating disinformation. And I would like to think that we're not at the end, right, of a very depressing road, but at the beginning of what could be a more transformative movement. So I'm gonna end with that. And we have time for, we have 10 minutes for questions and discussion. Kristen?
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for Brad. I'm wondering if you could talk more about when you're teaching particularly kind of historically situated literature and that, like how, in conversation with your students, how you balance sort of historical context versus connections to current issues. Because something I've noticed when trying to get students to talk about historic media and things is oftentimes if they're not totally comfortable with the history, they'll want to make a lot of one-to-one connections with things going on today. And that can be totally useful in terms of a certain kind of critical engagement. But also like the 16th century rural Spain is not 21st century Montreal. And
no, it's not. I think that, yeah, it's, I think as in everything else, it's a constant process, right? I've told the story many times of how Vivek and I started working together when he brought me to a death metal show in Puerto Rico, right? And death metal is more satanic. It's sort of religious. It's grounded in religious imagery, religious motifs, and although they're satanic, right, they look a lot like the imagery that you would find in 16th and 17th century religious theater, right? And you're right, it's not the same thing, but they are both involved in the construction, right, of a certain kind of spectator, right? They are both involved in, I'm not so sure about death metal, but certainly in the case of 17th century religious theater, othering, right? The demonization, the blood libel that Lucy was referring to yesterday, anti-indigenous, anti-Muslim, anti-Protestant, It's mainly an anti-theater. It's very hard to figure out what the pro is in the end, other than obedience to the church, right? And so I use those as illustrations of contemporary examples of othering, of expulsion, of racism, of hate speech. How do you keep them separate? You keep them separate by keeping both languages, maintaining the integrity of both languages and both historical periods, and not allowing students to. So the most productive moments in those conversations are when students try to cancel medieval or early modern authors, because they're not as feminist, they're not as open to gender fluidity, they're not as anti-racist as contemporary texts, right? And so those are the moments where you can both draw distance by saying censorship has real effects on what people can say and how they can say them, right? And censorship being the Inquisition in 17th century Spain, right? And we live in relatively progressive times. But that also allows you then to see incipient forms of censorship, or even more advanced legislative expressions of censorship as they're going on in the US for what they are, right? And so it's a constant dialogue. I have students in class, I have them compare and contrast early modern texts to contemporary movies in student presentations, right? And usually the discussions after these presentations will last anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes, depending on how dense the topics are, right? And so we don't solve it, right? It's a conversation. And all I'm trying to do, I don't want to build a sort of impenetrable edifice of knowledge of 16th and 17th century Spanish literature for them. I just want to provide them some critical tools with which they can negotiate these things for themselves, right? So that would be the goal. Thanks for the question.
David, I am thinking back to your graph earlier that was showing education and conservatism, I can't say that word right now, you know what I'm saying, and climate denialism. And I'm just wondering about epistemological diversity and how these identities become so fixed and so rigid that someone who can, how can we bring people to take on multiple identities and say, I can be a fundamentalist and someone who has pro-social or pro-environmental discourses. How can all those things be true at the same time? So it's I'm just thinking about this idea of these very fixed and rigid identities, and thinking some of the work of James Paul G, where if we ask a student to take on a new identity when they have one that's very fixed and held, we're on a collision course here. So what can we do about that?
Well, I mean, I'm not too optimistic, surprise, surprise, in terms of what we can do about this, Julie. I mean, one of my friends used to work with some conservative scholars, and he recalled to me about one episode. They were talking around the table, and the conservative guy was like, liberals always want to talk about complexity and how complex everything is, right? And I mean, I feel like the thing is that people who try to adopt the position that you're describing, where, you know, you're concerned about climate change, but, you know, maybe you believe in free markets too, you know, increasingly in the conservative movement, these people get tagged as like rhinos or like insufficiently orthodox or, you know, really Democrats at their core, or, you know, not sufficiently committed to the cause, right? I think that in our increasingly polarized contexts, there's less and less space for taking the kinds of mixed positions that you describe. I mean, what we've seen is a kind of partial disappearance of the political center, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for, you know, constructing one's own position and not always kind of holding a doctrinaire one. But I think the tolerance on both the right and the left for being non-doctrinaire is increasingly low.
Do we have any other questions? Oh.
I just wanted to thank all three of you. Really appreciate the conversation and the points a lot, especially in relation to yesterday. This is less of a question, but more, Kevin, I'm just thinking about what you are saying about the purpose. It's what you said is making me think a lot about the purpose of education, because, you know, I think a lot about how do we create contexts where kids have an opportunity to talk about issues, right, whatever those issues are. But that assumes that that's the goal in education, that we all agree that that's a good thing, to have discourse across different perspectives. And I think, you know, increasingly in the US, there are, you know, we're seeing that those kinds of discourses shut down in real ways, like in Florida, for example. So, you know, I guess I just want to underscore this point that this is a real concern for the teachers I work with, that they're not allowed to say certain things in their schools, and they can lose their jobs. They can, you know, it's actually a crime in some places. So I'm just thinking a lot about the assumptions we make, even about what education is for, and sort of what we're going for. Because maybe not everybody agrees, right, that we want to engage kids in conversations about their beliefs. That's like a very dangerous proposition. And yesterday, David was saying that the National Science Foundation wouldn't fund a project, and I'm probably not getting it quite right, but wouldn't fund a project that helped kids, middle school kids, engage in kinds of like conversations around controversial subjects, because Ron DeSantis's office, you know, said to the NSF that they wouldn't allow, he didn't want them doing this kind of thing. And I think that's really scary. Yeah, and it makes me think a lot about like, where do we go at this particular moment? And David, also just appreciate like the social psychology perspective that you brought. I think we're seeing in the last few years, we've seen so much research come out of social psychology around group membership, and why people believe what they do. And they don't, people don't care about what the facts are. And we see that in reading research. We can teach kids all the strategies we want, all the critical thinking strategies, but at the end of the day, they're just going to go back to what they believed before, which is why we want to engage them in like other, what are other perspectives and what are my perspectives. But I guess the question I'm left with is, how do we do that if we can't do that? So I guess that's also a very cynical position, a cynical ending that I'm landing on over here. And I think it feels like obviously like democracy is being.
You both said yesterday and this morning, I think, about being curious, skeptical, and persistent. Curious, skeptical, and persistent. I think we could apply it to this whole situation right now. I mean, this whole democracy thing, where is it going? Is it even working? Should we even stick up for it? What is what's the point of education? Let's be curious about it, and let's be skeptical about it. Maybe the positivist way is not to go with progressive education is not working, and then let's persist with it. Like Dad was saying, it's just the beginning. We just persist with it for some more time and see where it goes. Yeah.
Did you want to respond or?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure this is going to respond, but your comment did make me sort of think about something that I might want to clarify, and also, kind of ask back to you, because I have a question for both, well, you and Julie, but anyone who's sort of thinking about teachers and their role in this. The concern that I was trying to raise in my comments is that, the kind of the what I was calling the idealized or the traditional sort of picture of the teacher's role provides a certain sort of basis for justifying, certain kinds of interventions that could align with the sorts of strategies that you and Julie are proposing as ways of addressing disinformation, right? So if parents or other citizens complain that students shouldn't be we shouldn't be talking about climate change or any of these topics in the classroom, the idealized picture kind of offers a justification. Well, I'm not in raising these issues as a teacher, I'm doing so not to try to influence what students believe about controversial issues. I'm getting them to think as democratic citizens, right? And to sort of, think about what their, sort of role as democratic citizens and the values of democracy require of them. But once the sort of, the meaning and interpretation of those principles becomes so unsettled, that justification just increasingly lacks any weight, except maybe outside like really, hallowed halls of philosophy departments or something like that. So, I guess I'm connecting this, reflection to what I experienced the last few semesters as I've addressed these kinds of questions with my students, graduate students who are teachers, right? They're practicing teachers, most of them. So they come in and they're the ones who told me about the Andrew Tate story and how that's such a big thing for them. I was quite shocked. I mean, I didn't know who Andrew Tate was, but also just how every head in the class was nodding. Yeah, this is what they're hearing. When we talk about these kind of philosophical and theoretical issues, on the one hand, I'm hearing, these students, the ones who are nodding their heads, saying, well, what we can do, for example, the student was talking about teaching the Holocaust. What we need to do is teach the true facts and separate that from, the myths about the Holocaust. And I think that generalizes to other issues, right? That's kind of the instinctive kind of mental default that the teachers have, even though we've been talking about how, a lot of this doesn't have to do with separating facts from myths. It's more about, what is the emotional identity, communal sort of pull of these ideas. They sort of go there. But, even if we could sort of change, get students to sort of shift, and I think, probably there are ways to do that. If you ask them the next question is, would you address this in your classroom in this way? The answer that I get is no. I just don't feel. I like the approach. I like these ideas, but I'm going to get fired, or I'm going to get a real sort of blowback, and it's going to make my life miserable. I'm going to quit the profession, right? I'm going to become even more demoralized than I am. So that's where I was coming from, and that I kind of think the discussion has to be And it's a difficult discussion, and it's kind of where my hope starts to really fade, but I don't see any alternative to, something has to change outside of the schools. I mean, there are legal protections, right? I mean, I think Dave and I, with our colleague Bruce Maxwell, have written about, laws that, at least in Canada, offer teachers some protection, not so much in the US. Legal battles are costly in time and energy, and they don't necessarily guarantee success. You're not going to get, your principal isn't going to say, yeah, well, the school board's going to pay for your legal battle. More likely your contract isn't going to get renewed at the end of the year. So, I mean, I guess, I don't know if that really.
Yeah, my teachers, right, they say the same thing, and I think it depends a lot on the context of where they're teaching.
Yeah.
So, like, when I'm in Massachusetts, so a lot of teachers that teach in Massachusetts actually do say that they have, Massachusetts is quite progressive, and so they will say, they do have administrators that will back them, and in those contexts, they feel safe having those conversations. Like, one of my students was just saying the other day, one of her students.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
You can use this one. Sorry, we just have a few minutes left.
One of her students used the word gay in a derogatory sense. And in this case, her principal and her school, in that school, she wasn't allowed to have a conversation about it. The way that the principal handled it was to say, we're going to tell parents that parents should have that conversation. And so that they just never had a conversation about it in the school. And so in that case, the conversation, the discourse got shut down instead of opened up. And that was, it was in Massachusetts, I believe. But other teachers say that when their principals back them, they feel safe engaging in those conversations. So I think, if you're teaching in Florida, like, you're not allowed to use the word equity, for example. I think the context matters a lot. And then the other thing I was thinking when you were talking is that I guess where I originally thought maybe you were going with your comments was that some things are not controversial. Like, we teach some things like, this idea that we teach climate change as a controversial topic, when no, it's not controversial, right? Like, we have lots of scientific evidence around it. So I think that's I think it's a delicate line around, like, what kinds of things do we open up for discussion? If you're in my classroom and you say, anything, there are certain things, right, that I'm going to say, no, sorry, you can't believe that all people are not created equally. Like, that's just a no. But I think it's something I wrestle with, like, where is that line where we open up conversation and where we just say, like, no, that's just not going to fly in here.
Yeah, I think this is a great place for us to start thinking about the next time that we get together and talk. We're about 10 minutes over the time for the session. I want to thank David and Kevin for some great talks and a great discussion. Again, thank all of you for being here, and congratulate all of us for a great conference. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone at the CLSP, especially Brad and Franklin and Daniela, as well as the CISC with Mark Sussman and Vivek. Thank you to Brad, Kevin, and David for coming into ForeSpace today and activating this conversation. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and live stream now, but just a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it. So thank you for joining us for this terrific 2-day conference. Obviously, there's lots more to discuss here, so we hope to see you again here at ForeSpace.